Good evening, everyone. My name is Gilbert, and on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this virtual event with Ken Bernstein as he discusses his book, Preserving Los Angeles: How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities, which can be purchased by clicking on the Buy button below. For now, Vroman's Live will continue to host virtual events, which you can learn more on our website as well as our social media. Our next event is tomorrow, April 27th at 5 p.m., as we host Jenny Lee in conversation with Catherine McGee, discussing Jenny's book, Anna K.O.A. For regular updates on upcoming Vroman's Live events, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter and our social media. Today's virtual event will have a Q&A component. So to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like Ken to answer, please click the like button, which is a little arrow on the side of the question. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And since we're talking about all the business at the bottom of the screen, another reminder that you can purchase a copy of tonight's featured book, Preserving Los Angeles, by clicking on the Buy button directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website, where you can continue your checkout process. We will have some signed copies, but those won't be available to this weekend. But go ahead and click that put signed copy in the comments section of your purchase, and we'll do our best to accommodate you. Now, Vroman's is the oldest independent bookstore in Southern California. We are 127 years old. We've been around since 1894, and it's thanks to avid readers and our generous patrons like yourselves who keep our business alive. So we appreciate every bit of your support. All right, let me introduce our author. Ken Bernstein is a principal city planner for the Los Angeles Department of City Planning, who oversees the city's Office of Historic Resources, which is responsible for Los Angeles's historic preservation policies and programs. And he leads the department's Urban Design Studio, which works to elevate the quality of design for private development projects and major civic investments. The lead staff member for the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, Ken has overseen the completion of Survey LA, a multi-year citywide survey of historic resources, and has led the city's efforts to create a comprehensive historic preservation program. Before joining the Department of City Planning, Ken was Director of Preservation Issues for the Los Angeles Conservancy, the largest local nonprofit historic preservation organization in the country. Vroman's patrons, please welcome to our virtual stage, Ken Bernstein. Ken, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. It's such a pleasure to be here virtually at least with Vroman's. I want to thank you and Vroman's for all you do. And I really always felt that Vroman's itself is one of the cultural treasures of our region, not just because of our age, but because of all you offer to us culturally in the Los Angeles area. And it would be wonderful to be with you in the upstairs space above Colorado Boulevard, but it feels like that's not too far off now.
Much closer than it felt before, and we look forward to that for sure.
But it is wonderful to be with all of you, be able to connect with so many of you in your homes tonight. So let me, if I can, share my screen, make sure this will work properly, and we'll get started. Okay, working okay?
All right. Good, Ken. Looks good.
All right, great. Well, again, good evening, everyone, and very much looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about the process of creating Preserving Los Angeles and some of the key ideas that I've shared in the book. And this is a book that I decided to write because it felt to me that while there have been many books on Los Angeles, of course, and many books on architecture in Los Angeles, there had not really been the actual story of historic preservation in Los Angeles. That is not a story that had been told comprehensively. And I've often been frustrated as people talk about Los Angeles by the often repeated claim that Los Angeles is a city that doesn't care about preservation, doesn't care about its history, doesn't care about its historic buildings. And I know that none of that to be true. And I've also been frustrated in many ways by the way Los Angeles is depicted by often East Coast writers or reporters who kind of parachute into the city for a few days, think that Los Angeles is all Tinseltown in the entertainment industry, and think they've captured the city in all of its complexity. And I have been fortunate to be in a role within city government in Los Angeles where I've had a bird's eye view of historic preservation and had an opportunity to work very closely with communities throughout Los Angeles and see how preservation is making a difference in many of our communities. And I wanted to try to capture the more interesting and complex Los Angeles that I knew. And what I've seen as well is that historic preservation is often perceived as being about stopping change or blocking progress. And in fact, in Los Angeles, historic preservation has been one of the primary engines for actually driving positive change in the city, really helping to revitalize our downtown in the city and transforming neighborhoods, creating economic revitalization, and even helping significantly to create housing and creating affordable housing. And I wanted to bring that Los Angeles preservation story to a wider audience, and both to Angelenos and those in other cities, including Pasadena and our San Gabriel Valley cities locally, who could benefit from some of the lessons learned in Los Angeles, especially those who have lingering misconceptions about what Los Angeles really is. And I think that once you start to look at Los Angeles more carefully through the prism of historic preservation, you'll find that you see a very different city, a much more interesting and nuanced city from the cliched version of Los Angeles. But I have a very hectic job with the city of Los Angeles and felt like I never quite had time to tell that story. But recently my kids moved out of the house. Our last one moved on to college. We became empty nesters, and I took on what I started to call my weekend project, which was this book. And so I kind of slowly and steadily chipped away at telling this story, really trying to write every weekend over the last 2 years. And this has been a labor of love for me. And in that spirit, I decided I wanted to donate my proceeds from the book to 3 national organizations that are working toward greater representation and inclusion in historic preservation. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Latinos in Heritage Conservation, and Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, APIA-HIP. All of them are doing work that very much reflects some of the themes that I'll be discussing in my book. I also knew that I wanted the book to be a visually rich account of preservation in Los Angeles, to show everyone, not just tell all of you about the power of preservation. So part of this was finding the right photographer, the right partner for this project. And I certainly did in Stephen Schaefer, who many know as Schaef. He is a preservation leader in his own right. He's on the board of the California Preservation Foundation and works actively in preservation in his own community as a volunteer in Ventura. So while I could have had any photographer do this book, commercial photographer, someone who captures architecture, Schaef, what he brought was really a preservationist eye as well, and just in many ways intuited what it was I was trying to convey with some of the selections of the book. And so we were really partners on this project. We worked closely together on this, and he will tell anyone who listens as well that I gave him a 65-page shot list, which was very daunting, of course, at first. And he ended up shooting over 19,000 separate images that got culled down to just over 300 that made the final cut of the book. And here's Schaef on his SUV atop, looking at out at the LA basin from the Hollywood sign, from behind the Hollywood sign. And here's the image he captured from up there. So his photos, I think, really make the book, visually compelling. So I wanted to give you first a little bit of a taste of the book and some of its key themes. And part of what I wanted to capture is that while, again, many people perceive preservation as being about saying no or stopping change and progress, preservation has been driving progress in so many ways in Los Angeles, throughout the city, and certainly here in downtown. As you're seeing, developers and property owners are finding that preservation and adaptive reuse, converting historic buildings to new uses, adds economic value to their project. And Angelenos are increasingly seeking out places that have historic value. These are buildings with history, beauty, and authenticity as their preferred places to work and live. You've seen that. Those of you who are from Pasadena are very familiar with the power of preservation, going back to the revitalization of old Pasadena a few decades ago. And just as Pasadena found throughout the city and in old Pasadena, in Los Angeles, increasingly, it's those areas that have the highest concentration of historic resources that are those areas that are seeing the greatest amount of activity and revitalization. And so I think, consistently, home buyers, businesses, and others are seeking out what only historic buildings can provide. And the book really describes how that's happening with many examples from across the city. But in addition to the specific content about how preservation has transformed Los Angeles, and by extension can do the same in other cities, I wanted to capture my own continued sense of fascination and discovery about the city. And I think for many authors, the act of writing is the act of discovery. They kind of find their story, or for fiction writers, find their characters as they go through the process of creating their work. And for me, the act of creating this book was less about that and more kind of channeling my own journey of discovery as a professional working in historic preservation. I've been very fortunate that my work, again, kind of takes me to great places throughout the city. I have responsibility for identifying and documenting and protecting the places that help really define the second largest city in the United States. And I get to see what I call in the book the real Los Angeles, again, getting beyond those cliches, and help community leaders and property owners and others preserve and revitalize the places that matter to them. And so what I love about my work is that I'm not only discovering more every day about historic preservation, and that itself is continually evolving and changing, but I continue to discover the city. For as long as I've been here, I'm still learning and discovering remarkable new places around the city. So for example, like the first time I got to visit the Garden of Oz in the Hollywood Hills and met Gail Kottman, who's the remarkable property owner who helped make this, what you see on your screen, all possible. She worked with 75 of her friends who were artists, including the artist Beatrice Wood, to evolve this space into really a children's folk art and peace garden, containing what you see here, a Munchkin land with a symbolic yellow brick road and a throne to Dorothy, tributes through thrones, musicians like Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Elvis Presley, and peacemakers like the Dalai Lama and Rosa Parks, who were saluted here. Gail Kottman only occasionally opens this to the general public, but otherwise distributes a key to neighborhood residents and other artists who get a chance to experience this. And through her generosity, we got to photograph this for Preserving Los Angeles and share it with a wider public. And this is just one of many examples as I have gone through my career in historic preservation. So often I feel like as I go to some of these places, if only I could just share this and take people along with me, just see this, I think people would have a very different view of what Los Angeles is all about. And I wanted to do that through the book. And part of me as well reflects who I am and some of my own background. I've really always been fascinated by the city. I grew up in the West San Fernando Valley and of course didn't have a car of my own. So I would pester my dad until he agreed to take me on adventures through the city that I wanted to explore and get to know better. And I'd actually sit in my room with the old Thomas Brothers map, the Thomas Guide, and read the pages, kind of study the form of the city and plan our next adventures. And so sometimes we did get out and I got to see more of the city. And this is me actually at Olvera Street at age 8 and taking it all in. I then ended up kind of doing the same with my kids. And I was always the one who would drag my kids and our out-of-town family members on day-long treks through historic LA. And I would torment my kids as they were growing up by insisting on stopping at every downtown historic core or every quaint Main Street historic district, stopping to take note of every designated historic structure, usually ending up with one of them kind of crying out in exasperation when I insisted on stopping to read yet another historic plaque somewhere. So that's kind of what I wanted to do through the book. I hope not leaving all of you in exasperation, but to do more than provide practical content, which is certainly there in the book, about how preservation has transformed Los Angeles and how to go about doing preservation in many communities. I wanted to infuse through the story a sense of my own discovery and fascination about the city. And I hope that the sampling of historic Los Angeles that I'm providing in the book will be a springboard to each of you in watching this, and I hope becoming readers of the book, to embark on your own journey of discovery through Los Angeles. So the story kind of starts, first of all, with the power of historic designations themselves. And City Hall, it's really a product of city government, how city landmarks, if they are designated, and LA City Hall is one of those, help protect historic places from demolition or help create their dramatic transformation. One example of that has been the Idle Hour in North Hollywood. And this is a great example of what's often called programmatic architecture, where the form of the building reflects its use. And as you can see, this was a bar that was shaped like a whiskey barrel. And it really only endures today because it had historic designation. It was originally commissioned by a film technician for Universal Studios, and the building was purchased by a couple, Jose and Dolores Fernandez, who opened a flamenco dinner theater called La Caña. And Dolores danced there for many years, and then the club closed in the 1990s and 1980s, I think, excuse me. And if you know, of course, the Mother Goose nursery rhyme, The Old Woman Who Lived in a Shoe, this became the story of the old woman who lived in a barrel. Dolores Fernandez lived in this whiskey barrel and grew old here, living there until 2009 with a small menagerie with her. While the building itself deteriorated and became threatened, she moved into a rehabilitation facility, and the building's future was very much in doubt. But historic designation for the site, Chris Nichols, who's an editor with LA Magazine, active with the LA Conservancy Modern Committee, nominated the site, and it became designated. And so when the property was auctioned off after Dolores's death, prospective buyers knew it had a level of protection. And a gentleman named Bobby Green and his partners bought the property. And he and his partners spent $2 million rehabilitating the barrel into a bar once again, restoring original stained glass on the ceiling and doors, reclaiming ceiling planks, and adding an expansive patio around a large ficus tree. He also relocated to that patio outside of the bar a 1960s reproduction of a 1928 programmatic building called the Bulldog Cafe that once sat on Washington Boulevard and had been on display at the Peterson Automotive Museum. So it's a wonderful example of how historic designation can lead to regeneration and rebirth of historic structures. LA has also been a preservation pioneer. Again, many people are not aware we had one of the earliest preservation ordinances in the country, dating back to 1962, before New York, Chicago, Boston, many other cities you would think would have been before Los Angeles, even before Pasadena, I believe. In addition to being a preservation pioneer, we were a pioneer in LGBT activism. And an example of that is one of our historic cultural monuments called the Black Cat in Silver Lake, which was really an example of some of the first activism around LGBT civil rights. So you often hear about the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, but about 2.5 years before that, in 1967, there had been a raid of this bar on New Year's Eve with about 14 patrons being arrested, and a melee had ensued. Weeks later, several hundred supporters of those who were arrested converged on this site to participate. It was one of the first U.S. demonstrations to support gay rights. And that led to a court appeal that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on equal protection grounds, breaking new ground in this area. So this was designated as a historic cultural monument in 2008, and it reflects the fact that historic preservation doesn't only protect architecturally significant buildings, but places that have great social and cultural significance. So in addition to the designation of individual structures, we have seen in Los Angeles the designation of historic districts. And in Los Angeles, we call them Historic Preservation Overlay Zones, or HPOZs. It's one of our most effective tools for protecting entire neighborhoods. And we now have 35 of these local HPOZs, or local historic districts, with about 21,000 properties in LA. And we tell the story in the book of how these historic designations have transformed many communities. And in Los Angeles, many of these historic districts as well have tremendous economic and demographic diversity. I think that's different from many other cities. The share of our non-white population within the HPOZs is actually higher than the citywide average. So it shows how historic neighborhoods consistently attract a very vibrant and diverse mix of residents. And one example of that is the Jefferson Park community. The Jefferson Park HPOZ in South LA has, since its designation, really sparked some significant reinvestment and really knit together a very diverse community. And this photo of one of the streets in Jefferson Park also shows how drought-tolerant landscaping is not at all incompatible with the historic setting in many of our local historic districts. Some of our historic districts are actually, two of them are from the post-World War II era. One of those is the Balboa Highlands neighborhood at the far north end of the city in Granada Hills. It's one of the tracts developed by Joseph Eichler, who developed about 10,000 homes in the Bay Area. This is one of his few Southern California tracts, and our youngest HPOZ from 1962 to 1964. And since we're at least virtually in Pasadena tonight, I wanted to share the HPOZ closest to Pasadena, the Highland Park Garvanza. It's our HPOZ is our largest historic district with about 4,000 properties, and really reflects that arroyo culture that extends into Pasadena. The images here show Professor's Row along Sycamore Terrace in Highland Park, and that's a neighborhood that was once adjacent to and had professors living in it from Occidental College before they even moved to Eagle Rock, where it is today. And the Judson Studios, which is the oldest family-operated stained glass studio in the nation, among the many treasures of Highland Park. And Highland Park also has our largest historic commercial district in the HPOZs along Figueroa, and shows how historic status can help create economic revitalization in a neighborhood like this. And we've seen many restaurants and bars and nightlife outlets open in Highland Park. Our HPOZs also show how historic status is not inconsistent with accommodating density and growth and change in our region. Los Angeles has shown that, and this is just an example from our Lincoln Heights HPOZ, that there's a natural level of density that's livable and walkable. There was a study that showed that done by the firm Place Economics for the Los Angeles Conservancy last year, that the number of residents per square mile in our designated HPOZs is actually 50% higher than the residential density of the rest of the city, and higher than the residential densities in Boston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And here in Lincoln Heights, you see a hip roof cottage on the left, in the middle, a Spanish colonial revival triplex, and at the far end toward the right, a prairie craftsman style apartment building, all kind of distinct uses, distinct densities, but it all kind of hangs together within a designated historic district. And then, in a book that has so many spectacular photos from SHAFE of our LA buildings and places, I wanted to make sure that the reader doesn't forget that historic preservation is ultimately about people, the people who inhabit and give life to some of these spaces, and the people whose passion and commitment really make it all possible. So I was pleased to feature 10 preservation profiles that illustrate just a few of the Los Angeles people who are making a difference in preservation, not all of whom are traditional preservationists. So you see here Michael Diaz, who joined with other local leaders, a couple of whom are pictured here, to create that HPOZ in Lincoln Heights, really seeing preservation as a tool for community building and revitalization. Or Kristen Hayashi, who had been a PhD student in history, hadn't been involved in preservation at all, but stepped forward as a volunteer for the Little Tokyo Historical Society to nominate a site in Boyle Heights, east of Little Tokyo, the Japanese hospital that tells the story of 5 Japanese immigrants who built a hospital for their community in the 1920s at a time when immigrants were being denied health care. So it was an honor to create a place in the book for many of these voices to become part of the larger preservation story, and to have that come forward in their own words. But I want to make sure also that I'm not painting an overly rosy picture of historic preservation in LA. There are many areas that we still need to do better. And one of those is in the area of equity and fuller inclusion in historic preservation. And we've been working hard in Los Angeles to enhance diversity and equity and inclusion in some ways that I'll discuss in a moment. But it's still the case that there's a disproportionately small number of sites in Los Angeles that have designated historic status that reflect African-American heritage. Only 3% of our historic cultural monuments reflect African-American sites or history. And the results are not much better for other communities of color. It's about 6% for persons of color more generally in terms of percentage reflecting within our overall historic cultural monument program. So we clearly need to take a close look at why that's the case. One of those that is designated is the new Temple Missionary Baptist Church that's on South Broadway in South Los Angeles. And another example of a site that was designated not for its architecture, but for the role it played in our cultural history. It was the site of the recording of Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace album in 1972 that became the best-selling gospel album of all time. And there was a film made of it by Sidney Pollack that actually didn't see the light of day until 2 years ago after Aretha died. I had the privilege of being invited to the film premiere in this space, and many of the choir members who sang with Reverend James Cleveland on that night in 1972 were present in 2019 in the same space, singing along with their younger selves up on the screen 47 years earlier. And that was just a moment that speaks to the power of place, the power of history, unlike many others. And I think, again, why designating these sites are so important. And we want to do more of that, certainly with African-American history and many other cultural sites in the city. 2 weeks ago, we launched in the Office of Historic Resources, the Los Angeles African-American Historic Places Project in partnership with the Getty Conservation Institute that is meant to begin to rectify this disparity and bring forward nominations of African-American heritage sites and look at really all of our preservation processes and practices through an anti-racist lens. So we want to share more of that in the book, how Los Angeles has been extending historic preservation beyond its traditional focus on significant architecture. And some of that we've done through the preparation of what we call historic context statements, which really begin to develop the key themes that shape the growth and development of the city, and then tie that back to significant places in the city. And we've done that now through the Office of Historic Resources in partnership with many of our diverse communities of the city. And one of those is an African-American history context that addressed a wide range of themes, from the civil rights movement to racially restrictive covenants, the history of the Black church in Los Angeles, and many others. But one of the key themes was how local newspapers help ground the African-American community. And a place that helps tell that story is the Joseph and Charlotta Bass House in Southeast LA. This was the house of the co-publishers and editors of the California Eagle, that was a really prominent African-American newspaper in Los Angeles that helped tie together the community for many decades. And this 1911 bungalow is actually also in one of our HPOZs on 52nd Place, one of our smaller local historic districts, with this very interesting clinker brick porch piers that they have. Another one of the key historic contexts that was prepared was the Latino Los Angeles context, which discussed, among many other themes, the visual arts and the tradition of murals, the muralist movement in Los Angeles that shaped our public realm and to a great extent. And a wonderful example of that is the Great Wall of Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley, in the community of Valley Glen. The vision of Judy Baca and her nonprofit, Spark, the Social and Public Art Resource Center, along the wall of the Tujunga flood control channel. This was created over a decade-long period, 1974 to 1984, by teams of youth working with Judy Baca and other artists. And it really offers nothing less than an alternative social history of California and Los Angeles, addressing immigration, women's rights, racism, the struggle for gay rights. And our Office of Historic Resources actually successfully nominated the Great Wall for the National Register of Historic Places as an outgrowth of some of the work on the Latino Los Angeles context. There were also 5 Asian Americans in Los Angeles historic frameworks that were created, supported by a National Park Service grant. One of those addressed the Japanese American history of Los Angeles and extended well beyond what you might think of in Little Tokyo to look at other Japanese American settlements across the city, including Sawtell in West Los Angeles. And Sawtell by 1941, prior to World War II and the Japanese American internment, had 26 Japanese American nurseries serving the surrounding community. There are just a few of those left, and one of those is this Yamaguchi Bonsai Nursery from 1934, really reflecting the still intact business district in Sawtell. It still has Japanese American restaurants and other businesses that reflect that heritage. And then preservation in Los Angeles has really led the way in creating our downtown renaissance, fueled by adaptive reuse, converting older buildings to new purposes. And it was the adaptive reuse ordinance of the city from 1999 that helped clear away many of the impediments to those types of conversions. You see here the stunning rooftop pool and deck of the Eastern Columbia building on Broadway downtown, one of our great Art Deco buildings of the city. But there are many examples. One of those is the subway terminal building. One of the notable downtown projects called the Metro 417 Apartments, reflecting its address at 417 South Hill at 4th and Hill downtown. And the building opened in 1925. And many people don't know that before the Red Line opened in the 1990s in Los Angeles, we actually did have a subway. It ended up being only a 1 mile line. It was supposed to have been much longer. But while that 1 mile was built, about 65,000 commuters passed through this subway terminal building during its heyday in World War II. But the trains stopped running by 1955, and the office building had become mostly vacant by the 1990s. So the adaptive reuse ordinance allowed the upper floors to be converted to 277 spectacular loft-style apartments, and that once magnificent office lobby was significantly restored, and you can see the beauty and authenticity that provided for its residents. The project also showed how historic preservation incentives are key to the revitalization story of what historic preservation brings. This used federal rehabilitation tax credits and a program called the Mills Act, which is a property tax-based incentive, helping to create new housing opportunities through preservation. And adaptive reuse is not limited just to downtown Los Angeles, but it also adds value to businesses throughout the city. Google was looking for a new home in Los Angeles, and it didn't go looking at conventional office space. It looked to a historic building, the long vacant hangar in Playa Vista near the coast, where Howard Hughes once built his famous Spruce Goose, the H-4 Hercules, the flying boat that flew only once. And Google collaborated with ZGF architects to really bring about a stunning reuse of that building for creative office space. And I think it's wonderful that this hangar, which once reflects the kind of creativity and iconoclastic nature of Howard Hughes, is now one of the key anchors for what's often called LA's Silicon Beach. And in other locations, adaptive reuse has represented an important approach to creating new affordable housing. The Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights, that was originally built and called the Cummings Block, is one of the earliest commercial structures in the city, dating from 1889. It began as a hotel and a social and political center for its community, and then it became known as the Mariachi Hotel, becoming a residence for musicians who congregated at Mariachi Plaza directly across the street. But a nonprofit, East LA Community Corporation, bought the building, and from 2010 to 2012, converted the historic building to 30 units of affordable housing, with 21 more added through an addition, and then restored many of the historic features. And it really shows how historic buildings can provide affordable housing and can accommodate compatible additions that can provide even new and additional housing construction. So finally, a large part of the book captures the work of Survey LA, which was completed in 2017. It's been the largest and most ambitious citywide historic resources survey in the nation, a partnership between the city and the J. Paul Getty Trust, which really began with sort of a daunting challenge, the sheer size of our city. You see the map of Los Angeles here with 8 of the largest cities fitting within its boundaries with room to spare. And how do you take into account what and where all the historic resources are throughout such a huge city? We did, through Survey LA, send survey teams out literally down every street of Los Angeles to identify significant historic resources. This was all anchored in a robust public participation program to kind of crowdsource information about places that matter to local communities. And we created in the Office of Historic Resources new technological tools to make it possible to do all this as a digital survey. And all of the information was ultimately collected in a website that's now our inventory of historic places called Historic Places LA at historicplacesla.org. And the purpose of collecting this information is really to guide good planning and to inform long-range plans, that preservation can only succeed if you know what and where your historic places are in the first place. And so this information helps guide community members, policymakers. It tells developers where historic resources may be, so they can take that into account before their development decisions are set in stone. So I wanted to reflect all of this work in the book, and a significant portion of the book, therefore, features what I called Survey LA Discoveries, a sampling of some of the most interesting finds from years of combing the city by these survey teams. And it reflects every community in Los Angeles. And as well as I thought I knew the city going into Survey LA, there were still so many buildings and places that surprised me along the way. And so I'm going to keep you in suspense on some of that, and we'll hold that for a little bit as we open it up for questions. But before I do, I just wanted to close with this image of the binoculars, which was Klaas Oldenburg, the artist who did this in collaboration with the architect Frank Gehry, who designed the Chaya Day building here in Venice. It's our youngest historic cultural monument. And I use this kind of metaphorically in the book to open the final chapter, which was called Looking Ahead at the Future of Preservation. And the binoculars, as we look ahead at preservation, I think, we covered in the book some of the emerging topics such as climate change, racial justice, preserving the recent past, and more. And to get my take on all that, you'll need to read the book. But I think as we look ahead through these binoculars, what keeps me so excited about preservation is how the future of the past is still constantly evolving, and how there's still so much more that's left for us all to look out at and discover. And with that, I want to close, and I'll have a little lightning round at the end with some Survey LA images, but I do want to stop and open it up for your questions and discussion.
Oh, thanks so much. That was great, Ken. There's tons of fascinating information, and we had some people in the comments section who are just like, "This is great."
Fantastic.
So don't forget, everybody who's tuned in right now, if you would like to ask a question, you go ahead and use that Ask a Question button down there at the bottom. Type it in there. We've only got a couple right now, so we have time to take some more. So let's get started with that. Our first question is from Joaquin, and he said, can you please discuss additional cultural historic sites in Boyle Heights that capture the multiracial history of the neighborhood?
Well, there's so many. That's a great question. Boyle Heights, I think, in many ways has been the kind of quintessential community where so many cultures and ethnicities have come together in the city. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's just east of downtown Los Angeles. And it was a place where, it always has been kind of an entry point for recent immigrants. And so you saw, especially during the period of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, multiple communities living together in the Boyle Heights neighborhood that included Japanese Americans, Russian immigrants, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and the growing Mexican American population of the city. And there are many sites that reflect that. There are a number of sites that reflect the Jewish heritage of Los Angeles, and there is a Jewish Historical Society of Southern California that does, when not in COVID times, take folks through the Boyle Heights community on bus tours and tour many of these sites. One of the most significant to the Jewish community has been the Breed Street Shul, the historic synagogue on Breed Street. That is one of the few intact grand synagogues that remain in the Boyle Heights community. And the Jewish Historical Society now owns that and has been pursuing a multi-year preservation and rehabilitation effort for that historic synagogue. Many people don't know the original Cantor's Delicatessen was on what was Brooklyn Avenue before it moved. It now Cesar Chavez, but now moved, of course, in the 1940s to Fairfax. But that building is still intact. And many other sites that reflect the Mexican-American heritage of the city. Of course, the Japanese-American heritage I referred to is already with the Japanese Hospital and other sites. We've been going through a historic designation recently for the International Institute of Los Angeles, a site that is very significant for having offered education offerings for new immigrants over a period of decades. And that has currently been going through a historic designation process, again, less for its architecture and more for its cultural history in Boyle Heights.
Great. Let's see. We actually have another one from the comments section from Angela. She is asking, how is the growing community land trust model related to historic preservation?
That's a great question. I have to say that maybe is an area that we haven't seen as much activity as we should. I've spoken in the book and tonight about the potential of historic preservation to be an important source of affordable housing. But I have to say, while we're seeing active neighborhood land trusts in terms of coming in, stepping in and purchasing properties and securing them for affordable housing, I'm not immediately coming up with an example of where that has come together with some of the power and potential of historic preservation. So I think that's certainly one of those areas for future growth and development in the field.
Excellent. Joyce asked, does Evergreen Cemetery in East LA have a historic preservation designation?
It does, and now I'm trying to remember what status it has. But yes, it does have protection. Well, actually, I have to double check that. I believe some of that is outside of the Boyle Heights kind of verges into unincorporated county East LA. So I'm actually maybe need to double check that. I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that a portion of it at least does.
Excellent. Everybody, if you have any more questions, go ahead and please ask them in the Ask a Question tab down there at the bottom. I have a question for you, Ken. So obviously, and you touched on it a little bit, obviously our big connection here to Hollywood and the filmmaking industry, and how over time, how much has that played into the preservation of LA? I mean, I know it goes in the items that you did talk about that have relation. It goes back quite a ways. So I would imagine that there was was there a push from that industry to make sure certain things were being kept preserved?
That's a great question. I didn't focus on that significantly in the book. I felt like I wanted to tell the story of the other LA and look past it. Right. But of course, first of all, I think there's been, in many ways, a lot of effort put into the preservation of some of our historic studios themselves. And I think while there's been some demolition and some change, I mean, if you look at Fox Studios in West LA, Paramount in Hollywood, and others, we have many historic studios that are intact. Others that were identified in Survey LA that were less known. Some of the Max Sennett original studios and others, and well as Hollywood post-production facilities that are very intact in Hollywood. So the preservation of historic Hollywood itself, Hollywood the studios, and as well as Hollywood the place, has been very significant. Hollywood has also reinvested in some of our historic places. I think one that comes to mind is Disney and the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood. And again, while we do lament what we've lost, and we have lost some historic buildings in Los Angeles, the fact that we've preserved many of our Hollywood movie palaces and historic theaters, including the El Capitan, the Egyptian Theater, in part with American Cinematheque, the nonprofit, now more recently with Netflix stepping in and reinvesting in the Egyptian, the Chinese Theater. I know everyone's concerned now about the Cinerama Dome, which has historic cultural monument status, and Pacific Theater's withdrawal from the Cinerama Dome. I'm certainly hopeful that Hollywood will step up and preserve that as a remarkable film venue that it is. But we have lost, I have to say, in my days at the Los Angeles Conservancy as a preservation advocate, we had a significant loss of a site related to Hollywood history, the Ambassador Hotel. And that was probably the biggest disappointment of my preservation career when that was demolished, and the LA Unified School District missed an opportunity to adaptively reuse that as the centerpiece of a new school campus. And the Hollywood community did come out in force to advocate for that. It had been the home of the Coconut Grove nightclub and really a gathering place for Hollywood for decades, in addition to being the tragic site of the Robert F. Kennedy assassination in 1968. But alas, we fell a vote or two short at the LA School Board from preserving and adaptively reusing the ambassadors. That was a major loss, but I think overall, there's been some significant care and attention to that level of Hollywood history.
Excellent. We do have another question here from, let's see, this is from, sorry, let me get it open. This is from Steve. Steve asks, besides the Dunbar Hotel, has there been any attempt to save what's left of Central Avenue's deep musical history?
Yeah, that I do talk about that in the book, and unfortunately, we have not. That is an area we have not done a good job, and we lost just a couple of years ago the last of the intact jazz clubs on Central Avenue, and that was an area that, in its heyday, 1930s, 1940s, had was the center of the Los Angeles jazz and musical scene. Central Avenue, was the place, and in part that speaks to the history of exclusionary racial covenants in Los Angeles, that the Black community could really only live in that portion of Southeast Los Angeles, Watts, and a handful of other areas. But there was a very vibrant musical community, and unfortunately, there was not an effort to designate any of those sites as city historic cultural monuments, and one by one, they disappeared. I spoke about the new African American Historic Places initiative that is coming forward between the city and the Getty. And I think one of the things we want to look at is, in communities that have lost some of their intact, don't have an intact physical heritage in that way, how do we think about cultural preservation and cultural identity in communities like that? And is there more of an interpretive program or another approach that could help better kind of make that history legible in a way that even if the buildings themselves are no longer intact? But the loss of the Central Avenue jazz corridor, if you will, while there is some signage that's been put up by some city council members in the last decade or so, that's a significant loss to the city that is no longer intact.
Yeah, that is a bummer. And hopefully the work will continue for that. We do have one more question, and then we can get back to the last part. And this is from Diane, and she has a question that is related to your hometown area. Are there any sites in the San Fernando Valley that don't yet have historic preservation designation, but should?
Well, there are many. So that's a great segue into my next segment. So I'm about to show you some, but the book probably has another 150 or 200 that again, all of the sites identified in Survey LA and showcased in the Survey LA Discoveries section are those that have been identified as appearing eligible for designation. So that professionals have said, we think that these are that they meet the criteria for designation, at least as a city historic cultural monument. So everything in that whole section of the book in the valley, and I showcase every community of the city, from Chatsworth at the far northwest end of the city down to Wilmington and San Pedro, the harbor, and everything in between. Everything in that Survey LA Discovery section is worthy of consideration and worthy of better understanding and recognition. And we hope someone might come forward and designate those sites. Our designation process is open to anyone in terms of someone coming forward with a nomination to our city's Cultural Heritage Commission and the City Council. But that is a great segue, if I might go back and show you a few of these sites. Let's let's see here. All right. So we will pick up, whoops. Let's see. Let's try this again. Okay, here we go. So as I said, I wanted to share what I was calling the Survey LA discoveries that are really some of the hidden gems from Survey LA. And this section of the book, just to be clear, is not kind of the greatest hits of LA architecture necessarily, all the designated landmarks. It's really more kind of the hidden gems of Los Angeles. And more, what I wanted to evoke a little bit more was not that, wow, I love this very familiar landmark, but wow, I never knew that was there. And this was hidden in plain sight in my own community. And so, there's over 300 sites featured in the book, and I can only show a little over a dozen very quickly in this kind of lightning round. But here are a few of the places that I personally found quite interesting as Survey LA discoveries. One of them is the Kyusing Chan residence, and kind of also speaks to the question, the multicultural heritage of Boyle Heights. This is in Boyle Heights as well, a Queen Anne home that was the residence of one of the few Chinese Americans to be able to own property in the city and in Boyle Heights during a period of anti-immigration sentiment. And he was the first Methodist minister of Chinese descent in the United States and came to the US after having been a court interpreter in China. So there's a remarkable story embedded in this also very beautiful house in Boyle Heights. And another Boyle Heights site that reflects some of that history is the Mexican Mission Church. And many of you might know the celebrity evangelist Amy Semple McPherson, Sister Amy, founder of the Foursquare Gospel Church. And you might know Angela's Temple in Echo Park, which she built in the 1920s. But you may not have also known that she established a series of other churches, several neighborhood churches, that were meant to outreach to the Mexican American community of the city that was growing during those years. And this church in Boyle Heights has served a Spanish-speaking population since 1930. Then there's some just kind of intriguing homes architecturally. And this is a potentially eligible historic district called the Brunswick Avenue Fantasy Bungalows. And it gets back to the question about the entertainment industry and the influence of entertainment. This is one of those sites that shows the influence of set design and of Hollywood design on the landscape in Los Angeles. This was built by a real estate agent named Barney Knaufel, but he incorporated kind of the influence of Hollywood set design, Moorish revival, Egyptian revival, elements onto what are mostly otherwise Spanish colonial revival residences. And he was inspired by the sets of silent films. And you can see some of the unusual patterns and shapes and the variety of the homes in this neighborhood. This is in the Atwater Village neighborhood of Northeast Los Angeles. And then a little taste of Europe in the Hollywood Hills. This is called Hightower, and it's an elevator in the Hollywood Hills, an elevator tower in the form of an Italian campanile. And it provides access to hillside homes from the garages below as part of the original 1920s Alta Loma development. It was linked to a network of concrete pedestrian stairways and walkways. Some of the selections in the book were just meant to be kind of fun and interesting. I think this is one of them. The Fleetwood Center in Tarzana on Ventura Boulevard in the West San Fernando Valley. So yes, we did include a mini mall in the book, but it's quite a mini mall. And as you can see, the building's design evokes a 1970s Fleetwood Cadillac. And then also in the West Valley is Epiphany Lutheran Church in Canoga Park, designed by architect Edward Davies, and has this soaring A-frame chapel conveying what's often called Googie architecture. Googie influences mid-century modernism and kind of an optimism of the mid-century period in a religious structure. And you can contrast that church in the West Valley with another in the Northeast Valley, the Calvary Baptist Church in Pacoima from 1957, less significant architecturally, but very important to the African-American community of the San Fernando Valley. It was associated with Reverend Hillary T. Brodus, who played a major role in breaking down the racially restrictive covenants in the San Fernando Valley and the segregation that existed residentially in the valley. And this church was the site of important civil rights rallies in the 1960s and still remains a very important community center in Pacoima to this day. A little further to the southeast in the East Valley community of Sun Valley, we find the Pink Motel and Cadillac Jack's on San Fernando Road in Sun Valley, one of the best remaining examples of a roadside motel and coffee shop in the San Fernando Valley. At one time, there were many motels along this stretch of San Fernando Road because it was Highway 99. It was kind of the gateway to the Valley and Los Angeles from Northern California before the interstate system was built. And most of those motels have been demolished or substantially altered, but this one has been preserved and is used exclusively today as a filming location. So heading from here over to the west side, we find the Orilla Kempton Residence from 1906. And it's a craftsman home with some Queen Anne influences. And this is an example of where the old real estate adage, location, 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 comes into play with historic significance. So homes of this time period are quite common in the central city area, but very rare on the west side. And this is the oldest remaining residence in the Mar Vista community, located actually within Los Angeles' first gated community atop Mar Vista Hill. And then not too far away from Mar Vista in the community of Del Rey is this tiny little building on Berryman Avenue from 1922. Again, not so significant architecturally, but it happens to be the only remnant of the early 1920s Barn City wild animal circus and zoo. And this was both a circus and zoo. It had a zoo with 4,000 animals that was always open. The circus performed on this site and then toured, and the zoo remained open when the circus wasn't happening on the site. And this was actually part of a separate incorporated city called Barn City in the 1920s that then later got consolidated in the later 1920s into the city of Los Angeles. And this is all that's left of Barn City. A different type of remnant way down in the harbor district of the city is this Roosevelt Memorial Park Organ Pavilion. And it was a freestanding building that was designed to house an organ that was called the Mightiest Wurlitzer, because it was designed to project organ music throughout the vast memorial park, this vast cemetery grounds. And the organ was actually said to be audible at least 5 miles away from this building. The building remains intact, but the organ was damaged by the 1933 Long Beach earthquake and then was removed after it became unplayable in the 1950s. And the organ still remains in storage today, but the organ building remains quite intact within the Memorial Park. Going into some neighborhoods within the city, the Vermont Knolls neighborhood was developed in South LA between 1928 and 1939. And it was near the original campus of Pepperdine University way before Pepperdine moved to Malibu. And you can see from this photo that Shafe took the wonderful consistency of massing and yet the visual variety within this district. And this is a neighborhood that's been working recently to achieve local historic district HPOZ status. A few miles east of Vermont Knolls in southeast LA is this neighborhood called Goodyear Gardens, which had 49 single-family homes built in 1920, significant as a rare example of worker housing, housing built for their workers by an industrial manufacturer, in this case, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. And they were located nearby on Central Avenue, just down the road from where all those jazz clubs were that we were talking about. And this is a neighborhood that speaks to the history of LA as an industrial center and the families who were part of that working legacy in the city. And then I wanted to finish with just a few sites that represent the constant change or evolution of our historic places, what I like to think of as layers of history that I really find fascinating. And one of those sites is 708 El Medeo in Pacific Palisades. And this started out as a small 600-foot house that was part of the Case Study House program of mid-century modernism in 1948. But in the 1970s, Eric Owen Moss, who has become a very prominent architect, re-envisioned this as a kind of postmodernist, deconstructivist house. And it became very significant in its own right as an Eric Owen Moss design. And the Schaef's photo just captures this. It's a remarkable composition that you see here. I was curious about the colors and the design on the taxi cab and the planter here. And it turns out that the home it had been in the Moss family, but is no longer. And it's now owned by a couple named Dawn and Ed Massey. And Ed Massey is the artist and creator of a project called Portraits of Hope, a nonprofit that specializes in art projects for hospitalized children and for students of all ages. And their work utilizes this flower motif and has often included New York City taxi cabs. So this is a fascinating house with these layers of history, the case study movement, postmodernism, and now being remade again. And another example of that is the American Hotel, originally named the Canadian Hotel for its first manager, who was Canadian, located in what's now the Arts District, just on the eastern edge of downtown. A very early LA hotel building that was built as a first-class hotel for African Americans, many of whom worked as Pullman car porters. And then decades later, from the 1970s to the 1990s, it had a very different level of significance. It became the site of Al's Bar, which was really the preeminent home of LA's punk rock movement and later the grunge rock movement of the 1990s. So very different chapters of history as our historic buildings can change and evolve. And then finally, a neighborhood called the Crenshaw-Seenon neighborhood, Crenshaw-Seenon Potential Historic District, 71 properties off of Crenshaw Boulevard in South LA, significant for its association with the Japanese American community that gravitated to this community after the internment of World War II. And for several decades, it became a largely African American neighborhood and continues to evolve with demographic change today. But you can see that these remnants of the Japanese American heritage, some of the small architectural touches, and certainly the bonsai and landscape features in the neighborhood, these layers of history are visible in our community. And really, just to wrap up, I mean, that's the Los Angeles that I was hoping to convey in all of its layers, all of its complexity through preserving LA, a much more interesting and nuanced city, I think, we might all realize. And as we zoom back out from the close-ups of LA places and architecture and look out at the city from the Griffith Observatory, the twinkling lights of the LA basin, I hope that tonight and your further exploration through the book itself will bring back into focus how historic preservation can make a difference in the city, and specifically in Los Angeles, that these layers of history and meaning, again, as they represent the real Los Angeles, that all of that will start to become much more legible and much more meaningful to you as you continue to explore your own Los Angeles. So with that, I just want to thank you all very much for participating, and again, hope the book is meaningful to you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Absolutely fantastic. So many great things, and I agree. I really hope that this does spur interest in some people to make sure that the things that they love dearly, that makes that they can do what they can to help out and look more into it. We did have one question that I thought I would follow up with.
Okay.
Gail had asked if there was any plans to do anything with the thousands of photographs that didn't make it into the book.
That's a great question. There are many of them are different versions of the same sites, of course. So, but I think Schaef may end up sharing some of those in different ways, and perhaps in social media as well. We're thinking about what we might do with the book in the future in some different ways. And again, I think it's a blueprint for people who want to use it for preservation in their own communities, but we also hope it's a springboard for further exploration of Los Angeles. And so, we'll think about how some of those images might get out there as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
The book is beautiful. It's from Angel City Press, who we at Vroman's absolutely adore. They just check out their site, and you can see all the amazing books that they've published. And this is up there with all of them. So you can go ahead and click on that Buy Preserving Los Angeles button down there at the bottom. That'll take you to our website where you can order it there. Vroman's is open currently, so as things different health guidelines change, we are continuing to stay open, so you can come by and visit us if you are in the area and buy a copy there. Buy more than one copy if you'd like. They make great gifts. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. So Ken, thank you again so much. We really, truly appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks to Vromans, and we all need to support our independent booksellers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, thanks again, everybody. You can still, if you would like to watch this again, you can use the same link to get back to this. This will be recorded, and you can rewatch it on the Crowdcast, and it'll be available on the Vromans YouTube channel within a week or two. So, Ken, have a great night. Thanks for being a part of this. We look forward to having you in the store.
Fantastic. Thanks.
All right. Good night, everybody.